All right. Before we end the lecture on forming requirements, we're going to address a topic that is pretty important to the business analyst's day to day work. And that topic is the various types of documents that are commonly written in the course of specifying requirements. The challenge with this topic is just the sheer magnitude of document templates and the wide variation in how they are used in different organizations around the world. Each of the companies I worked for had at least one set of templates. Indeed, my last two employers had several sets of templates each because there were different standards at the company division level. Today we're going to be talking about three different sets, but even before that, you might wonder, why do we have these templates? What are they supposed to do for us? I think that's the right question, because if we understand what these templates are for, we'll be more likely to use them in the right way. We'll be able to understand which to use when, and very importantly, we'll be able to understand their limitations. I view requirements templates as helping out in at least two primary ways. First, they serve as a starting point in a checklist for new business analysts. It can be intimidating to start your first project or even your first few projects. And commonly we wonder, wow, where do I even get started? Well, these templates help us to answer the question by providing sections for the more commonly used analysis deliverables. So that's definitely a plus. Second, the templates, they provide kind of a common layout for the organization, for all the organization's projects. This is helpful for people who look at requirements documentation from different BAs and different project teams and departments. Those requirements reviewers can easily figure out the layout of the document because it's the same from project to project. And in my experience, people that commonly look at lots of requirements documents, like development managers and program administrators, they both tend to be big fans of requirements templates. But, of course, we have to understand their limitations as well. First, none of the templates is perfect. They may have 20 different sections describing different types of requirements and model artifacts, but they might lack a section for a particular type of modeling that's valuable to your project. That's very common. Also, they commonly use, they tend to anyway, they use IT industry jargon. Sometimes they reference IEEE standards and SAS 70 audit requirements and other terms that make little or no sense to technical or governance lay people. So to address these limitations, well, if there's a section missing from a template, I've always felt free to add the required section into the document, and I can't remember getting any pushback on that personally. And if there is a term in the template that you don't understand, just ask your boss or your PM or a more senior business analyst what that term means. However, in my experience, it's pretty common for them also not to understand the term, but give it a shot anyway. All right. The first set of templates we'll cover was actually created by Carl Wiegers in his book Software Requirements. I was talking about that one before. It's a great book. They're also available for sale on his website, which is processimpact.com. There are two documents that Wiegers prescribes, and those are the Vision and Scope document and the Software Requirements Specification, or the SRS. This was actually the first set of documents that I started using when I was just getting going in business analysis myself. Usually the documents are drafted by the authoring business analyst in the order given. So typically we write the requirements into the Vision and Scope document first, review that document with the team, etc., and then we move on to the SRS with the more detailed requirements that flesh out the core of the solution that the development team will be building. We spent a lot of time talking about different types of requirements earlier, and that discussion will help us out now. In this set of templates, the Vision and Scope document contains the business requirements and quite a few other things too. And the SRS contains the user requirements, the functional requirements, and the non-functional requirements. And again, quite a few other things too. I don't really have any major criticisms of this set of templates. They're well thought out, they're pretty well formed, and they have a good structure. The only thing I'll caution you about is that when requirements documentation is broken out into two or more documents, there is a tendency for the implementation and testing people to ignore the documents that don't directly provide them with work items. So in this case, to be specific, the downstream teams might not read the vision and scope document because they see the SRS as providing the stuff that they actually have to plan from. So if you're going to use this set of templates, just keep in mind this, this concern, and make sure that the right documents are being reviewed by the right people. The next set of templates are, they're actually sets of templates, and those are what we call business requirement documents and the functional requirements documents. I call them sets of templates, plural, because there are probably hundreds or thousands, God only knows, hundreds or thousands of these templates in existence today. Your organization probably has a set of these. If not, an internet search will provide all the templates you'll ever want to see in your life. BRDs tend to do one of two things. They either contain all the business requirements, similar to the vision and scope document that we just talked about, and leaving the user functional and non-functional requirements to the FRD, or they contain the business requirements and some of the user requirements, leaving the remainder of the user requirements to the FRD, along with the other functional and non-functional requirements. As you can imagine, I'm not crazy about this setup. My prior concern still holds with this document. If the business requirements are held in a separate document from the user and functional and non-functional requirements, there can be that same tendency for the downstream teams to pay little attention to the BRD. My concern is even stronger, though, when it comes to placing some user requirements in the BRD and other user requirements in the FRD. This significantly increases the chance that requirements that should be implemented will be missed and cause problems later in the project. You'll almost certainly use BRDs and FRDs at some point in your career, maybe even today, and I'll strongly recommend that you place the user requirements in their entirety in the FRD. I remember a few years ago, I was the lead for the Business Analysis Center of Excellence in a division of a large U.S. bank. And some of the BAs on my team came to me with this problem. They complained that the development team was ignoring the BRD and only reading the FRD. And this, by the way, is understandable. Remember the interests of the development team. They tend to have a strong need to be able to just sit down and write code rather than reading endless amounts of documentation. That's very understandable. But to help overcome this issue, while still enabling the development team to effectively handle their own work, I asked one of the team members to just come up with a consolidated BRD and FRD document, which we ended up calling it's not very creative, but we called it the business and functional requirements document. No, it wasn't a very creative name, but it helped reduce the amount of writing that the BA had to do, and it also, reduced the amount of reading that the development and testing teams had to do. There are certainly benefits to having a single requirements document for that project, and if you can find a way to do that, I will strongly encourage you to do so. All right, the last type of written requirement format, I guess you can't really, I guess you could call it a template, but it's not really a document template. They're called user stories. User stories are a format of requirement that are most commonly used in Agile projects. They're used to capture and define requirements at let's say a high to intermediate level of detail. The typical format for a user story is what I just put up on the screen. It goes like this. And then you insert the role of the user. I want, and then you put the requirement. So I can, and then you have the rationale. Here's an actual example on the screen now, a hypothetical user story for the beverage sales tracking system that we've been talking about. Okay, as a sales manager, I want the summary report to list each of the beverage products available for sale by the organization so I can understand the report. And you can see that it's really just an alternative phrasing of our user requirement UR1 from earlier Typically, user stories aren't added into documents. They tend to be written on either sticky notes or index cards and stuck to a board, or entered into a work tracking system or a spreadsheet or something like that. The heavier document templates tend to be used in waterfall and hybrid projects. User stories tend to be a little bit lighter on detail due to the more conversation-oriented agile approach. Okay, so before we wrap up our conversation on common requirements documents, and indeed our discussion on forming requirements, there are a couple frequently asked questions that I'd like to cover. The first is, can I just ignore all these templates and just use a spreadsheet? Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't see why not. There are a couple of reasons why this makes sense. Spreadsheets make it easy to sort columns and filter information on the spreadsheet. And that's helpful if you want to enable yourself and your readers to arrange the information flexibly. You can, for example, sort requirements by priority or sort them by user type, really any way you want. Advice-wise, if you're going to do this, you might also want to add a column in there, which is separate from the requirement ID, that just has a plain number for the requirement. And that lets you get back to the original sorting before you did any sorting and filtering and all that stuff. The disadvantages of not using a template are largely that you don't get the reminders that the template holds. The reminders to specify non-functional requirements, that kind of thing. But yes, a spreadsheet is fine with me. Check with your boss, though, because it might be mandated by the company that you work for. The second question relates to various requirements management systems that are used by many organizations. And that question is, how can we effectively use these systems? Well, that's a very large question, larger than I can address here. Most of the system vendors provide their own training courses on how to implement sound requirements development and management processes specifically within their tools. But I will give you a couple of tips. First, if you invest the necessary time to become an expert on the tool, you'll save yourself a lot of time and trouble later. The tools tend to be somewhat complex, but fortunately they have a lot of good documentation that goes along with them. The second tip is to also explore and join and ask questions of the online user groups for those tools. If you're having a hard time trying to figure out the best way to, for example, structure requirements or something like that, chances are that someone else has already had a similar problem and come up with a good solution. So that way you won't have to reinvent the wheel. Well, that wraps up our discussion on forming requirements. Our next lecture on transforming requirements is up next, and I encourage you to take a break first. It's quite in-depth, and you'll need your focus to get through the material.